The mountains held their breath that night, and so did Juniper. She stared at her mama's face, pale in the candle's flicker. The room smelled like fear, like sweat and iron, like the end of things, shadows on the walls twisted into monsters. Mama's breath was a tiny failing bird in her chest. "Baby girl," she rasped, her voice a ghost. "You run." Juniper's whole world was this cabin, this woman. Running was not a thing she knew. Run down the trail, don't stop, find someone. Tears cut clean streaks through the dirt on Juniper's cheeks. What if I can't find nobody? You will. Mama's hand, hot with fever, found hers. God's eyes are on the sparrow. He won't leave you. But Juniper felt left. She felt abandoned already. The baby inside Mama was coming wrong. Too soon, too hard. Juniper had seen that look in her mama's eyes before, that hollowed-out stare that said she was already halfway gone. She didn't want to leave, but she wanted losing Mama even less. She shoved the door open. The wind hit her like a fist. Barefoot, she ran. The ground was a bed of knives, pine needles, and frost slicing at her soles. The moon was a sick, pale coin behind the clouds, giving just enough light to see the roots that wanted to trip her, to swallow her whole. She whispered the words Mama taught her for the fear. "Keep me, Jesus, keep me." Over and over, until the words became sobs torn from her chest. It felt like forever, like she'd run clear out of the mountains and into the empty sky. Then she saw it, a flicker of light, a campfire, a tiny spark of hope in the endless dark. A horse stood tied to a branch, its breath a white ghost in the air. A man was crouched by the fire, his back to her. He was big, broad. His head was bent over something in his hands. Juniper stumbled into the clearing, gasping for air, a wild thing made of fear and desperation. The man looked up. He was tall, with a face like carved rock and a beard like rust. His hat threw a shadow over his eyes, but she could feel his gaze. It was steady, sharp, dangerous. "What's this?" His voice was a low rumble, like rocks grinding together deep in the earth. Juniper's chest felt like it would explode. "Please, mister, Mama's dying." She took another ragged breath. "You ain't scared of blood, are you?" The man didn't move for a long second. He just stared. Then he stood up, all in one smooth motion. The firelight caught on the dark fabric of his long coat. His boots were scuffed and worn, the boots of a man who did nothing but walk away. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask where she came from. He stamped out the fire with one heavy heel. He slung a worn leather saddlebag over his shoulder. He untied the horse. "Lead the way." That was all he said, and Juniper, who had been taught her whole life to fear strangers, had never felt so safe. But she was wrong. She shouldn't have felt safe at all. The man wasn't a savior. He was something else entirely. They rode double, the horse's muscles working hard under them. Juniper clung to the saddle horn, the man a solid wall of warmth behind her. Branches clawed at her face, trying to pull her from the safety of his arms. The horse's hooves struck sparks from the stone path, each one a tiny star in the oppressive dark. Every jolt of the horse's gait sent a fresh wave of panic through her. What had she done? She'd brought a stranger, a hard-faced man from the deep woods, to their door, to her mama. But the quiet way he rode, the sure hands on the reins, it felt like an answer, like the sparrow finding its branch. When they finally burst through the trees into their small clearing, the cabin looked fragile, broken. Mama's cries had faded. There was only the sound of the wind, moaning through the pines like a mourner. He dismounted and lifted her down, as if she weighed nothing. He didn't knock. He just pushed the door open and stepped inside. The cabin shrank around him. His shoulders seemed to scrape the rafters. He took one long look at Mama, lying pale and still on the bed. His jaw tightened into a knot of muscle. "She's losing too much," he muttered, his voice grim. He knelt by the bed, his presence filling the tiny, desperate space. Juniper stood frozen by the table, her knuckles white where she gripped the wood. "Can you help her?" He didn't answer. Instead, he began to roll up his sleeves. His forearms were roped with muscle, corded like old trees. And there, on his right wrist, was a scar, a thick white scar that cut across the veins. It wasn't the kind of scar you get from chopping wood. It was the kind of scar you get in a fight, or from a manacle. He opened his saddlebag. It wasn't filled with trail supplies. He pulled out a flask of whiskey, clean-looking rags, a small sharp knife, and a long piece of twine. His movements were rough, but they were sure, practiced. This wasn't the first time he'd stood in a room that smelled of iron and fear. Mama's eyes fluttered open. They were cloudy with pain, but they found his face. "Who?" "Name's Gideon," he said, his voice clipped and low. "Save your strength." Juniper watched, stunned. Her mama was a proud woman. She didn't take orders from anyone. But she closed her mouth and her eyes, a silent obedience that terrified Juniper more than her cries had. The wind rattled the window frames, demanding to be let in. Gideon poured the whiskey over his hands. The sharp, sterile smell cut through the thickness of the room. Then his dark eyes found Juniper. "Fetch more water. Tear those sheets. Long strips. Now." His voice wasn't mean, but it wasn't kind either. It was the voice of a man who expected to be obeyed, a man who didn't have time for anything else. Juniper scrambled to do what he said, her hands shaking so badly she could barely rip the fabric. The sound of tearing sheets was jagged, loud, like the sound of their lives being torn apart. Mama moaned, a low, keening sound. Gideon's voice dropped, becoming impossibly calm, like still water over deep rocks. "Stay with me, miss. You hear? The world's a mean place, but it ain't done with you yet." Juniper laid the strips of cloth beside him, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. For the first time all night, a tiny, fragile flicker of hope ignited in her chest. This man, Gideon. He knew what he was doing. He worked fast, his scarred hands moving with a strange grace. He wiped Mama's brow. He coaxed her to breathe. He tied his twine with quick, expert knots. He set his hands where they needed to be. Juniper knelt by the bed, her hand clutching Mama's. She was just a girl in a lonely cabin, with a dying mother and a stranger who moved like he'd seen 100 kinds of death. She had to ask. "Did God send you?" she whispered. Gideon didn't even look up from his work. His focus was absolute. After a long, tense moment, he spoke. "Maybe he did," he said, his voice rough. "Or maybe he just knew you needed somebody who wouldn't scare easy." The candle on the table guttered, casting his face in stark relief. He wasn't a savior. He was a man who had walked through hell and hadn't been burned. And now he had brought that hell right into their cabin. Dawn was a pale grey wound in the sky. The cold light seeped through the cracks in the walls, but it brought no warmth. The cabin was a pressure cooker of pain and effort. Gideon's hands, steady and sure, moved with an urgency that defied his calm voice. Juniper crouched on the floorboards, a small anchor in a raging storm, her hand locked with her mama's. Mama groaned, her body arching off the thin mattress. Gideon pressed a firm palm to her shoulder, holding her down, grounding her. "Easy," he said, his voice the low rumble of distant thunder. "Let it come." He positioned the clean rags. He checked the twine he'd tied. He nodded to himself, a quick, sharp gesture of a man confirming his own grim calculations. Juniper's throat was a knot of fear. She could only watch this stranger, this man with a killer's scar and a healer's hands, take control of their world. He moved with the rough grace of a man who had done this before. And lost. You could see it in the corners of his eyes, the shadow of a past failure. "Mama," Juniper whispered, her voice cracking, "you stay with me." Mama's eyelids fluttered, her lips were pale, trembling. "You be brave," she breathed out. Then another wave of pain hit her, and the room was filled with sound. Mama's cry, raw and animal, the creak and groan of the old bed frame, and Gideon's quiet, firm command. "Push." Juniper's hands trembled, but she moved. She wiped Mama's forehead with a damp cloth, just like Gideon showed her. Tears streamed down her face, falling onto the worn quilt, but she sang. Under her breath she sang the hymn Mama loved. "His eye is on the sparrow, and I know he watches me." The words were a shield against the horror. They steadied her, maybe they steadied Mama too. Because she pushed again, hard. Her face was a mask of agony. And then it happened. Gideon caught the child. His movements were swift, certain, the skill of a man who'd done it once by lamplight, a long, long time ago. A new cry filled the cabin. It was thin, but it was alive. A fierce, demanding sound that cut through the tension and made Juniper sob with relief, a wild, half-laughing sound. "It's a girl," Gideon said. His voice, for the first time, held a note of something soft, something like reverence. He tied the cord with an expert twist, swaddled the tiny, squalling bundle in one of the ripped sheets. "Strong lungs. That's good." He handed the baby to Juniper. She took her sister, this miracle, this impossible life. She stared, wide-eyed, at the damp, dark curls plastered to the tiny head. "Hi," Juniper whispered. "I'm your sister." But the victory was a flash of lightning in a hurricane. It was over as soon as it began. Mama was still bleeding. Too much. Far too much. The clean rags were turning a dark, horrifying red. Gideon's jaw went tight again, the muscle bunching under his skin. He pressed down with fresh rags, his whole body tense. "Stay with me," he said again. But this time it was louder, sharper. It wasn't an order, it was a prayer. A desperate, ragged prayer from a man who didn't look like he prayed. Juniper crouched at the foot of the bed, clutching the new baby to her chest, watching this stranger fight a war against death itself. He poured more of the whiskey onto the cloths, muttering something low and angry under his breath. His scarred hands pressed down, again and again, his arms shaking with the sheer effort of it. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Mama's skin was turning waxy. Her breath was just a faint rasp, a tiny flutter in the suffocating silence. Gideon's face was carved from stone, but his eyes were burning. It was like he was trying to keep her alive with his own will, his own fire. Then he said something that chilled Juniper to the bone. He wasn't talking to them. He was talking to the ceiling, to God, or to the devil. "Lord," he said, his voice a quiet, broken thing, "I've buried one already. Don't make me do it again." Juniper didn't know who he was talking about. A wife? A child? The plea was so raw it made her own throat ache. She pressed her cheek to the baby's head, smelling the new, clean scent of her, and whispered her own prayer. "Don't leave us, Mama. Please don't." And then the bleeding slowed. Just a little. But it slowed, slowly, agonizingly. Mama's breathing deepened. Her chest rose just a fraction more. Gideon let out a long, shuddering breath and sat back on his heels. Sweat darkened his hairline, plastered his hair to his forehead. In that moment, he looked 10 years older. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with being awake all night. It was a soul-deep exhaustion. "She'll live," he said finally. He sounded like he didn't quite believe it himself. Juniper felt a knot inside her chest, a knot she hadn't even realized was there, finally unclench. She brushed the damp hair back from Mama's face. Mama didn't wake up, but her fingers twitched, a tiny sign of life. Gideon stood, wiped his bloody hands on a rag, and rinsed them in the basin. "She needs rest. Keep her warm." He stoked the fire, adding logs until it blazed. Then he came and crouched by Juniper. She was still on the floor, still holding the baby. His big, calloused hand hovered near the child's head, as though he was afraid to touch something so small, so perfect. "She's small," he murmured. "But she's a fighter," Juniper said, her voice filled with a fierce, newfound pride. "Like Mama." A shadow passed over Gideon's face. Pain, memory, regret. It was gone in an instant. "Get some sleep if you can," he said, his voice back to its low rumble. "I'll watch." Juniper didn't argue. She curled up beside Mama on the bed, placing the baby carefully between them. She was lulled to sleep by the warmth of the fire, the weight of the new life in her arms, and the steady sound of Gideon moving about the cabin. A quiet, dangerous guardian. She thought about what Mama said. God's eye on the sparrow. Maybe God had been watching. Or maybe, in these dark and lonely mountains, God sent men like Gideon instead. Men who knew how to fight back against the darkness because they carried so much of it inside them. When Juniper woke, the sun was high. Pale gold light streamed through the single dirty window. Mama was still breathing, slow and even. Alive. Gideon sat in the rocker. His boots were on the floor, his hat was on the table, and his eyes were half closed. But he wasn't sleeping. He was watching. The way a wolf watches the trail. He rose the moment he saw her stir. She made it through the worst. Juniper managed a small, shaky smile, but then a cold knot of dread formed in her stomach. The night was over. He had done what she asked. "You're leaving now, ain't you?" He didn't answer right away. He moved to the table, poured a swallow of cold coffee from the pot, and drank it down in one gulp. Finally, he looked at her. "I've got to move on." Juniper's throat tightened. Her voice was small. "But what if Mama gets bad again? She's stronger than she looks." He pulled on his long coat, his movements deliberate, final. He was already gone, in his mind. Juniper stood up, clutching the baby, her only shield. "Please don't go yet." His eyes, hard as flint, softened for just a second. The briefest flicker of something that wasn't cold and empty. "I can give you one more night," he said, his voice solemn. "After that, the trail calls." Juniper nodded, a sharp pain in her chest. One more night. That night, the wind howled around the cabin, rattling the shutters like angry ghosts. Gideon sat by the fire. He wasn't resting. He was sharpening his knife. The long, thin blade caught the firelight, flashing red and orange. His scarred hands were steady, practiced. It was a tool, but he held it like a weapon. Juniper lay awake, pretending to sleep. She listened to the soft rhythm of Mama's breathing, the whisper of the baby's sighs, and she watched the man who had saved them. She wondered what kind of trail called to a man like Gideon. And she wondered, when he left in the morning, would the cabin just feel empty? Or would it feel unsafe again? Because now she knew. She knew there were things in the world to be afraid of. And the man sitting by her fire was one of them. Morning came soft and gold, spilling over the peaks and setting the frost on the ground ablaze with light. Gideon was already outside. The clean, sharp crack of an axe splitting wood echoed in the still air. Each swing was powerful, rhythmic, a sound that said a man was here, a protector. Inside, Juniper stirred. Mama was awake. Her eyes were clearer, and a faint touch of color had returned to her cheeks. She blinked at Juniper, her voice a dry rasp. "Who?" "His name's Gideon," Juniper whispered back. "He helped. He saved you." Mama's gaze drifted to the doorway. Gideon's silhouette was framed there, broad and dark against the morning light. She closed her eyes. Maybe it was weariness, or maybe it was shame that a stranger had seen her brought so low, so close to the end. Gideon came back inside, wiping his boots carefully on the old rag by the door, as if he didn't want to track the dust of his own world into theirs. He placed a pile of fresh kindling by the hearth. His movements were quiet, deliberate. "She's better," he said. It wasn't a question, it was a statement, an assessment. Mama nodded, her head barely moving on the pillow. "Thank you," she murmured, but her voice was tight, laced with the pride of a woman who wasn't used to needing help, let alone owing a debt she could never repay. Juniper kept herself busy with the baby, rocking her on the edge of the bed. Gideon brewed coffee. The hiss of the old enamel pot filled the quiet cabin. He poured a cup and placed it on the small table near Mama's bed. "You need strength," he said. Mama hesitated, then her hand, still trembling, reached for the cup. Gideon turned his back, giving her the privacy to be weak. A small, simple kindness that spoke volumes. He was supposed to leave. He didn't. For 2 days, he stayed. He didn't say he was staying. He just was. He patched the leaky spot in the roof. He repaired the broken hinge on the barn door. He chopped enough wood to last them a week, the pile growing into a fortress against the coming cold. He performed each task with a silent efficiency, as if he belonged there. But he never presumed. He would glance at Mama, a quick, questioning look, before moving a pot or mending a chair. Juniper became his shadow. She followed him everywhere, a barrage of questions. "Where'd you come from?" He'd just shake his head. "Why'd you help us?" "Your girl knows how to ask for it." "You got a horse name?" "Dusty," he said once, nodding toward the sorrel grazing near the tree line. Juniper grinned. "That fits. He looks dusty." When she laughed, something in Gideon's stony expression shifted. It was like watching ice crack. Something softer, something almost shy. In the evenings, they fell into a routine. Mama would doze in the bed, her hand resting on the simple wooden cradle Gideon had cleaned and repaired. The baby slept, and Gideon would sit by the fire, whittling. His knife, the same one he sharpened with such intensity, moved with a different purpose now. He shaved off small, perfect curls from a piece of pine. The firelight flashed on the blade. Juniper would watch, her chin in her hands, as the shavings fell like golden hair onto the floor. "You ain't scared of much, are you?" she said one night, breaking the comfortable silence. Gideon didn't look up from his work. "Plenty scares me." "Like what?" He hesitated, the knife stilled in his hand. "Losing what matters." Juniper chewed on that. It was a grown-up answer, a heavy answer. "Did you lose someone?" His hands stopped moving completely. The knife was frozen mid-shave. "Yes," he said finally, his voice rougher than usual. "Long time ago?" She knew not to ask more. The way he said it, the weight in those 3 words, it was a door slamming shut. On the 3rd morning, the world changed. The wind had a new bite to it. It smelled of snow. Gideon saddled Dusty. He moved with a grim purpose, cinching the girth tight. Juniper watched from the cabin doorway, her stomach a cold, sinking stone. "You're leaving." He glanced at her, his face impossible to read. "Lingered longer than I should." Mama was sitting up now, propped against a stack of pillows. She was still pale, but her eyes were clear, stronger. "You've done enough for us," she said quietly. But there was a challenge in her tone, a familiar pride that made her lift her chin. Juniper couldn't stand it. She darted to Gideon's side, grabbing the sleeve of his coat. "But the snow's coming. What if Mama gets sick again?" "She won't," Gideon said, his voice gentle for once. "You've got firewood. Food enough." "What if something happens?" Juniper's voice was a desperate plea. He laid a hand on her head. His rough palm was surprisingly warm against her tangled hair. "Then you do what you did before," he said. "You run, and you don't give up." His words were meant to be a comfort. They felt like goodbye. That afternoon, he mounted Dusty. He rode to the edge of the clearing. Juniper stood in the yard, holding the baby, who was now wrapped in a proper blanket. She watched him go. The world felt too big again. The mountains felt too quiet. But he didn't ride down the trail. He just sat there on his horse, the reins slack in his hands, staring out at the jagged peaks of the mountains, staring at the dark clouds gathering there. He sat for a long, long minute. Then, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the whole world, he turned Dusty back toward the cabin. He dismounted. "Snow's closer than I thought," he said, his voice gruff, as if he were angry at the weather, as if he were angry at himself. "I'll stay till it passes." Relief washed over Juniper so powerfully she almost stumbled. Mama didn't say a word, but her eyes followed Gideon as he unsaddled his horse and carried his saddlebag back inside. That night the first snowflakes began to fall, soft white veils drifting down from a grey sky. The wind rattled the cabin, the fire burned bright. The 3 of them, no, the 4 of them, were cast in a warm golden glow. Mama stirred in her bed. She whispered something Juniper couldn't quite hear. Gideon leaned closer. "Why?" Mama asked, her voice faint but clear. "Why stay?" He was silent for a moment, staring into the fire. The flames danced in his dark eyes. He answered, his voice that same low, calm tone he'd used on the night of the birth. "Because the storm's coming," he said, "and because nobody should have to face it alone." Outside, the snow hissed against the window pane. Inside, they sat together. No longer strangers, not yet a family. Something in between, something new and fragile and unnamed. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney, and it felt like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen when the storm finally hit. Because it wasn't just snow that was coming. It was a reckoning. The storm came down from the mountains like a hungry wolf. By nightfall, the world outside was gone, erased. There was only the roar of the wind and the blinding swirl of white. Snow piled in deep drifts against the cabin door, sealing them in. The wind clawed at the roof, a wild animal trying to get inside. But inside it was warm. The fire roared in the hearth, a defiant heart of light and heat against the fury of the storm. The small room felt even smaller now, but it was a comfort. Like the storm had pushed them closer together, whether they wanted to be or not. Gideon moved with a quiet purpose. He checked the latch on the door. He banked the fire just right. He made sure every crack and gap was sealed against the cold. He was a captain on a tiny ship, weathering a hurricane. Mama watched him from the bed. Her dark hair was loose, fanned out over the pillow. She looked younger, softer. "You're restless," she said, her voice just loud enough to be heard over the wind. "A storm like this can turn mean if you don't respect it," he answered, tossing another log onto the flames. The fire leaped and crackled. Juniper sat cross-legged by the cradle, rocking the baby, humming a nameless tune to drown out the lonely howl of the wind. Gideon crouched to check the fire again, though it didn't need checking. He was a man who needed to be doing something. A man who couldn't sit still with his own thoughts. When he stood up, Mama was still watching him. Her gaze was steady, searching. "You could have left before it hit," she said. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. "Could have. Why didn't you?" His broad shoulders rose and fell in a slight shrug. He seemed like a man who didn't know how to explain himself. Or maybe he just didn't want to. "Because you're not through the worst of it yet," he said finally, "and because a man doesn't leave folks alone in a storm." Mama looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting the edge of the blanket. "You've already done more than most would. I don't even know how to thank you." "You don't owe me thanks." His voice was flat, final. Juniper glanced between them. The air in the room was thick with unspoken things. Heavy. She laid the now sleeping baby in the cradle and crept closer to the warmth of the fire, curling up on the old rug. The storm's fury was a strange lullaby, and soon her breathing deepened into sleep. The cabin grew quiet. Only the hiss of the fire and the scream of the wind remained. Gideon sank into the old wooden rocker, his long legs stretched out toward the hearth. The orange light carved his face into harsh planes and deep shadows. He looked older, harder. Mama's voice, when she spoke again, was quiet, almost swallowed by the storm. "I thought I was going to die that night." He didn't answer. He just looked at her, his expression softening just enough for her to continue. "I kept thinking of Juniper," she went on, her voice gaining a little strength. "How she'd be all alone. Folks in town, they have their own troubles. Nobody would have taken her in for long. She'd have been farmed out, passed around like a stray pup." Gideon's hands rested on his knees. Still, patient, he was a good listener. "I prayed," Mama whispered. "It wasn't a loud declaration, it was a confession, just inside myself. Asked God not to let me go like that, not to leave her alone." She paused, and then you came. For a long moment, the only sound was the fire. Then Gideon spoke. His voice was low and carried a weight of its own. "I had a wife once," he said. "A little girl, too." Mama's breath caught in her throat. Winter took them both. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He gave a single sharp nod, his jaw working. "Buried them myself, right behind our cabin. Thought I'd laid down my own hope in that ground with them." He stared into the fire, but he wasn't seeing the flames. He was seeing ghosts. "Figured I'd just keep moving. Until the trail ran out." Her eyes glistened in the firelight. "Then why did you stop? For us?" He watched the flames dance and writhe. "I don't know," he said, his voice rough with an old, cold grief. "Maybe I saw her face in yours. My wife's. Maybe I just couldn't ride past and let it happen again." The wind slammed a fist against the side of the cabin, and the whole structure shuddered. Mama flinched, but Gideon didn't move a muscle. "I don't have much to offer," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "A roof that leaks. 2 more mouths to feed now. Folks in town already whisper. They say I should have gone back east after my man died. They say a woman alone doesn't belong here." "You belong," Gideon said. The words were simple, but he said them like they were an undeniable truth. Like a law of nature. She searched his face, trying to see if he was just being kind. "Even after all this?" He finally turned from the fire and met her gaze. His eyes were dark, intense. "You stayed alive when it would have been easier to quit. That counts for something." Something in her posture eased. She leaned back against the pillows, letting the warmth from the fire touch her face. Outside, the storm howled, but inside it was quiet. "You could stay," Mama said after a long, long silence. The words hung in the air between them, fragile and shimmering, like a spider's web. "At least at least until the thaw. Gideon's eyes flickered to Juniper, sleeping peacefully by the hearth. Then his gaze returned to Mama, to her tired, hopeful face. "I could," he said. His voice was quiet, but it was a promise. It carried a weight that filled the entire room, pressing out the sound of the storm. The fire popped, sending up a shower of sparks. Mama's lips parted, as if she was going to say more. But just then, the baby in the cradle stirred, letting out a soft, whimpering cry. In an instant, Gideon was on his feet. He crossed the room in 2 long strides. He lifted the tiny bundle from the cradle. He held her with a surprising, shocking gentleness. His large, calloused, scarred hands were a perfect cradle for the fragile life. "She's strong," he said, rocking her until she quieted. Mama watched him. She watched this strange, broken man holding her new daughter. And something unreadable flickered in her eyes. The storm raged, but the cabin felt steady. It felt anchored. Anchored by the quiet man standing in the middle of the room, holding the smallest, most important thing on earth. And for the first time since her husband died, Mama let herself believe she might actually see the spring. But spring was a long way off, and the thaw would bring more than just warmer weather. It would bring the wolves right to their door. Not the 4-legged kind, the kind that walk on 2 feet. The kind that Gideon had been running from all along. Morning broke clear and blindingly white. The storm was over. The world was reborn in snow and silence. The snow lay heavy and thick on the pines, each branch draped in sparkling glass. When Gideon pushed open the cabin door, it groaned in protest against the drift that had formed outside. A gust of frigid, clean air rushed in, smelling of pine and cold stone. Juniper darted past him, her boots crunching in the deep snow, her laughter ringing like tiny bells in the vast quiet. The baby was in Mama's arms, pink-cheeked, warm and utterly alive. A rare, true smile touched Mama's lips as she watched Juniper play. But the smile faded, voices floating up the path. 3 women from the town appeared, their dark skirts dragging through the snow. Their faces were pinched with a mixture of concern and morbid curiosity. They stopped short when they saw Mama sitting up by the fire, looking pale but whole. "Well, praise God," one of them, a woman named Martha, breathed. "We heard you were gone for sure." "Not gone," Mama said softly, shifting the baby in her arms. The women's eyes immediately flicked to Gideon. He stood just inside the doorway, one hand braced against the frame. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just watched them. His presence was a silent, powerful challenge. Martha stepped a little closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Some said you'd been left alone too long. That maybe you weren't meant to make it through the winter out here." Mama met her gaze without flinching. "We made it." The 3 women looked at each other, a silent conversation passing between them. Then their gaze returned to Gideon, their mouths tightening. Judgment and suspicion radiated from them like cold from a block of ice. Juniper ran back inside, breathless, her hair dusted with snow. "Mama, look, the creek's frozen solid." "Go play, baby girl," Mama said gently, and Juniper, oblivious to the tension, dashed back out. The women didn't stay long. They left a loaf of bread and a jar of preserves on the table, their duty done. As they walked away, their whispers trailed behind them like smoke in the cold air. The silence they left behind was heavier than before. Gideon walked to the table and picked up his saddlebag. He set it on the table with a heavy thud. "Snow's clearing," he said, his back to Mama. "Time I move on." Juniper burst back inside, her face flushed from the cold. "You can't." The words flew out of her, pure panic. "Not yet." Mama stood up. She was still unsteady on her feet, but she stood. She walked to the table, placing a hand on the worn leather of his bag. "She's right. It's too soon." His dark eyes met hers. They were calm, but firm. Resigned. "You don't need me anymore?" "No," Mama said. Her voice was quiet, but it rang with a surprising strength, a newfound certainty. "But we want you." The words hung in the air, simple, direct, startling. They seemed to surprise Mama as much as they did Gideon. Juniper's eyes went wide. Hope, bright and fierce, lit up her face. Gideon just stared at Mama. He looked at her for a long, silent moment. An entire conversation, an entire negotiation passed between them without a single word. Then he reached down and unbuckled the straps on his saddlebag. He set it on the floor, tucked away under the table. Slowly, deliberately, he took off his long, dark coat and hung it on the peg by the door. It was a simple action, but it was a surrender. It was an acceptance. Juniper's face broke into a smile so big she nearly dropped the mitten she was holding. "I'm staying," Gideon said, though the words were unnecessary, "for a while." But the way he said it, the look in his eyes when he looked at Mama, it sounded like more than a few days. It sounded like a promise. The cabin itself seemed to exhale. The fire snapped and popped, as if in approval. Gideon went back outside and began to cut more wood, the steady rhythm of the axe a reassuring heartbeat in the quiet landscape. Mama watched him through the window, her hand resting on the cradle. When he came back in, his arms loaded with firewood, the room filled with the scent of fresh pine and cold air. He set the wood by the hearth, then he reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small piece of wood. The piece of pine he had been whittling by the fire, it was carved into the perfect miniature shape of a horse. Without a word, he set it on the hearth, right beside the cradle. A tiny, silent guardian. Juniper crouched down to pick it up, her small fingers tracing the smooth, flowing lines. "Did you make this?" He just nodded. Mama's throat tightened. It was such a small thing. A scrap of wood. But it felt like a vow. As evening fell, they gathered at the table for a simple meal. Juniper chattered away, the baby cooed softly in her cradle, and Mama was quiet, but a deep, settled peace had replaced the fear in her eyes. Gideon poured coffee. His movements were slow, comfortable. This wasn't a grand romance. It wasn't a promise of forever, spoken out loud. It was firewood and a warm cabin and coffee in a tin cup. It was a tiny wooden horse, standing guard over a sleeping baby. It was the way Mama looked at Gideon when she thought he wasn't watching. And maybe that's how a home is really made, not with vows and ceremonies, but one small kindness at a time. One day at a time. But their one day was about to be interrupted, because down in the town the whispers were turning into questions. And someone had remembered a poster, a wanted poster, with a face that looked an awful lot like the quiet stranger who had appeared out of nowhere. The thaw wasn't just coming for the snow, it was coming for Gideon. The days that followed were a strange, quiet paradise. The snow held the world in a silent embrace. The cabin became their entire universe. Gideon taught Juniper how to track rabbits in the snow. He showed her which way the wind was blowing by tossing up a pinch of powder-fine snow. He taught her how to tie knots that wouldn't slip. He never talked about his past, not once, and Mama never asked. They lived in a fragile bubble of the present. One afternoon, while Gideon was out checking his snares, Mama was brushing Juniper's hair by the fire. "Mama," Juniper said, her voice small, "is Gideon our pa now?" Mama's hand stilled. "No, baby girl, he's a friend. But he acts like a pa." Mama didn't know how to answer that, because it was true. He fixed things without being asked. He made sure the wood box was always full. He stood between them and the cold, dark world outside. When he came back that evening, stamping the snow from his boots, he brought 2 rabbits with him. As he was skinning them outside, Juniper saw something she hadn't noticed before. Tucked into the top of his boot was the handle of a pistol. The metal was dark, worn. Not the kind of gun a farmer or a trapper carried. It was a fighting gun. The fragile piece of their little world shattered in an instant. That night, after Juniper was asleep, Mama found the courage to ask. They sat by the fire, the only light in the room. "That scar on your wrist," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "The gun in your boot. You're not just a drifter, are you, Gideon?" He stopped poking the fire. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. "No," he said, his voice low. "I'm not. Are you in trouble?" He let out a short, harsh laugh that had no humor in it. "You could say that." He finally turned to look at her. In the firelight, his face was a mask of old pain. "I was a doctor once," he said. The words sounded like they were dragged up from a deep, dark well. "Had a practice back in Missouri, a wife, a little girl named Sarah." He paused, swallowing hard. "There was a gang, the Black Creek Boys. They ran that whole part of the country. Their leader, a man named Silas Kane, his boy got sick. Real sick. They brought him to me. Mama listened, her hands clenched in her lap. I did everything I could, Gideon continued, his voice growing rough. But the boy died. And Silas, he doesn't take kindly to losing. He held up his right hand, showing her the scarred wrist. He said a doctor who couldn't save his son didn't deserve his hands. They were going to cut them both off. I got away before they could take the second one. Juniper, who had been pretending to sleep, felt a cold dread creep up her spine. They burned my house down, Gideon said, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion, with my wife and Sarah inside. The horror of it filled the small cabin. Mama gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. I've been running ever since, he finished, running from them and running from what I couldn't do. But you saved us, Mama whispered. You saved me, you saved my baby. That was different, he said grimly. That was a beginning. What happened to them was an end. He looked at her, his eyes burning with a terrible ancient grief. The name of your husband, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. What was it? Elias, Mama said, confused. Elias Thorne. Gideon's face went pale under his beard. He looked like he'd been struck. Elias Thorne, he repeated, the name like a curse on his lips. He was Silas Kane's right-hand man. He was there that night. He was the one who lit the match. The world stopped. The cozy cabin, the crackling fire, the sleeping baby, it all dissolved into a nightmare. The man who had saved them, the man who was becoming a part of their lives, his greatest enemy, the man who had destroyed his entire world, was the man Mama had married. Juniper lay frozen in her bed, her blood turning to ice. Her father wasn't just a memory, he was a monster. And that monster's past was coming for them all. It wasn't just a storm outside anymore, the real storm was inside their cabin, and it was about to tear everything apart. The silence that followed Gideon's revelation was a living thing. It was thicker than the snow outside, colder than the winter wind. It was the sound of two worlds colliding, two pasts, drenched in blood and fire, meeting in this tiny, isolated cabin. Mama stared at Gideon, her face a mask of disbelief and horror. No, she whispered, it can't be, Elias. He was a good man. He was a killer, Gideon said, his voice flat and hard. The gentle stranger was gone. In his place was a man forged in hatred and grief. He stood and watched while my family burned. I saw his face in the flames. The image was so terrible, so vivid, that Juniper squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block it out. Her father, the man Mama sometimes spoke of with a sad smile, the man whose worn shirt she sometimes held for comfort, a monster. I don't believe you, Mama said, but her voice trembled. The foundation of her life was cracking beneath her feet. Gideon stood up. He walked to his saddlebag, which had been sitting untouched under the table. He reached inside and pulled out a folded yellowed piece of paper. A wanted poster. He unfolded it and laid it on the table. There were two faces drawn in stark black ink. One was a crude but recognizable drawing of a younger Gideon. The other was a dark-haired, grim-faced man with a cruel twist to his mouth. Underneath the drawings it said, "Wanted, the Black Creek Boys, for murder and arson." The second face, it was Elias. It was her husband. Mama let out a choked sob and stumbled back, away from the table, away from the proof of the nightmare that had just become her reality. "Why?" she cried, her voice breaking. "Why did you stay? Why would you help the wife of the man who... I didn't know," Gideon said, his voice ragged. "Not until I heard the name. Elias Thorne. I never knew his last name." He looked at her, and the anger in his eyes was warring with a deep, soul-crushing weariness. "When I saw you, when I saw Juniper, all I saw was a woman and a child who needed help. All I saw was a chance to do it right this time. A chance at redemption, a chance to save the family he couldn't save before. And fate, in its cruelest twist, had made it the family of his mortal enemy." Juniper couldn't stay quiet any longer. She sat up in her bed, tears streaming down her face. "Is he coming? Is that man... Silas? Is he coming here?" Gideon's gaze softened as it fell on her. He walked over and sat on the edge of her bed. "I don't know, little sparrow," he said, his voice gentle again. "But Silas Kane isn't a man who lets things go. He's been hunting me for years." "But he doesn't know you're here," Mama said, grasping at a tiny sliver of hope. "Those women from town," Gideon said grimly. "They talk, the story of a stranger helping a woman in childbirth during a storm. That's a story that travels. It travels all the way to the ears of men who are listening for whispers of a man with a scarred wrist and ghosts in his eyes." He was right. Their salvation had also been their damnation. His act of kindness was a signal fire, telling his enemies exactly where to find him. And now, they weren't just his enemies. They were coming for all of them. Mama sank into a chair, her face in her hands. Her entire life had been a lie. The man she had loved, the father of her child, was a murderer. And now his sins were coming to claim her and her children. "What do we do?" she whispered into her hands. Gideon stood and walked to the window. He pulled back the simple cloth curtain and looked out at the endless, pristine white of the snow-covered mountains. "We can't run," he said. "Not with the baby. Not in this snow. The trail is watched. They'll be expecting it." He let the curtain fall, plunging the room back into the dim, flickering firelight. He turned to face them, and Juniper saw a change in him. The weary, haunted man was gone. In his place was a soldier, a warrior. His shoulders were squared, his eyes sharp and focused. "So we don't run," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "We make our stand, right here." The cabin no longer felt like a home. It felt like a trap. Or a fortress. Gideon walked to the hearth and picked up the poker. He looked at the heavy iron rod in his hands, then at the door. "Elias Thorne brought his sins to your doorstep when he married you," Gideon said, his voice cold as the winter outside. "I brought mine when I stayed." He looked from Mama to Juniper, his gaze lingering on the sleeping baby in the cradle. "This ends here," he said, "one way or another." The fire popped, a sharp, sudden sound like a gunshot in the tense silence. Outside, the wind began to howl again, as if it knew the ghosts of the past were finally coming home. And they were coming for blood. The next 2 days were a blur of grim preparation. The cozy warmth of the cabin was replaced by a cold, sharp-edged tension. Gideon was a man transformed. He moved with a relentless, focused energy. He boarded up the single window, leaving only a small slit to see through. He barricaded the door with the heavy wooden table. He sharpened his knife until the edge gleamed in the firelight. He cleaned and oiled his pistol, the quiet, metallic clicks echoing in the silent cabin. He was turning their home into a tomb. Or a fort. Juniper wasn't sure which. Mama worked alongside him, her face pale and set. She had cried her tears. Now a hard, protective instinct had taken over. She was no longer just a victim of her husband's past. She was a mother, defending her young. She tore strips from blankets, preparing bandages. She melted snow for water, filling every pot and bucket they had. She prepared what little food they had left. Juniper's job was to be quiet, to watch the baby, to stay out of the way. She watched Gideon. She saw the way he checked the perimeter, the way his eyes constantly scanned the tree line, the way his hand never strayed far from the pistol tucked into his belt. This was the man he had been all along, she realized. The drifter, the kind stranger. That had been the mask. This was the real Gideon. A man hunted, and now a man hunting back. On the third day, the waiting became unbearable. The silence stretched and strained, thin as a fiddle string. Every creak of the cabin walls, every sigh of the wind, sounded like an approaching footstep. Gideon stood by the slit in the boarded-up window, a silent sentinel. "They're coming," he said, his voice flat. Juniper's heart leaped into her throat. She and Mama rushed to his side, peering through the narrow gap. Far down the trail, at the edge of the woods, 3 figures on horseback had appeared. They were just dark shapes against the snow, but there was a menace in their stillness. They sat on their horses, watching the cabin, assessing it. "Is it them?" Mama whispered, her voice trembling. "It's them," Gideon confirmed. "The one in the middle. That's Silas." Even from this distance, Juniper could feel the evil radiating from the man. He sat on his horse with an arrogant stillness, a king surveying his domain. "What do they want?" Juniper asked, though she already knew the answer. They want me, Gideon said grimly, and they won't care who they have to go through to get me. He turned from the window, his face a hard, emotionless mask. Juniper, he said, his voice sharp but not unkind. You and your mama are going to hide. Under the floorboards. There's a loose board near the hearth. No, Mama said, her voice firm. We're not leaving you. This isn't a discussion, Gideon snapped, the command back in his voice. My fight is with them. You and the children will be safe. He pried up the board, revealing a small, dark crawl space. It smelled of dirt and damp. Get in, he ordered, tears welled in Juniper's eyes. We can't just leave you to fight them alone. He knelt down in front of her, his large hands gripping her small shoulders. He looked directly into her eyes. Listen to me, little sparrow. Being brave doesn't always mean fighting. Sometimes it means surviving. You need to protect your sister. You need to live. Do you understand? She nodded, sobbing. He helped them down into the cramped, dark space. Mama clutched the baby, who miraculously was still sleeping. Don't make a sound, Gideon whispered, his face a pale oval in the darkness above them. No matter what you hear, don't come out until I tell you. Then he slid the floorboard back into place, and they were plunged into absolute darkness. Above them, they could hear Gideon moving, the scrape of the table being dragged back in front of the door, the cock of his pistol. Then silence, a deep, terrifying silence, broken only by the sound of their own frantic breathing and the thumping of their hearts. A voice boomed from outside, amplified by the cold, still air. Gideon, I know you're in there, you gutless coward. I can smell you from here. It was Silas Kane. His voice was rough, cruel. Juniper clamped her hands over her ears. I've come for what you owe me, Doctor. A hand for a hand, a life for a life. Silence. Gideon didn't answer. Send out the woman and the children, Silas yelled again. My business is with you. Thorne's widow has nothing to do with this. A lie. Juniper knew it was a lie. This man would burn the world down to get what he wanted. Then they heard Gideon's voice, calm, cold. You're not getting them, Silas, or me. Turn around and ride away. This is your only warning. A harsh, grating laugh echoed from outside. A warning. From a dead man. You were always a fool, Gideon. There was a pause. Then the world exploded. A gunshot shattered the silence. The bullet ripped through the cabin wall, the sound deafening in the small space. Juniper screamed, and Mama pulled her close, muffling the sound against her shoulder. Another shot, and another. Then the sharp, deafening crack of Gideon's pistol answering from inside the cabin. The battle had begun, and they were trapped beneath it in the dark, smelling the dirt of a shallow grave, listening to the sounds of a man fighting for their lives. A man who was once their savior, then their friend, now their only hope. A man who was fighting the ghost of their own father. The world above them was a symphony of chaos, the deafening roar of gunshots, the splintering of wood as bullets tore through the thin cabin walls, the angry, muffled shouts of Silas and his men, and through it all the terrifying, methodical sound of Gideon returning fire. Crack. A pause. Crack. He was making every shot count. Juniper huddled in the darkness, her body trembling uncontrollably. Mama held her tight, one hand covering Juniper's head, the other clutching the baby, who had finally woken up and started to cry. Her small wails adding a heartbreaking note to the cacophony of violence. It's okay. It's okay, Mama whispered, over and over, though it was clear nothing was okay. A heavy thud shook the floorboards just above their heads. A body. Had Gideon been hit? Juniper's heart seized with terror, but then they heard Gideon's pistol crack again, right from that spot. He was alive. He was moving. He's only one man, Silas roared from outside. Rush the door. They heard the heavy running footsteps, then a massive crash as two men threw their weight against the door. The wood groaned, splintered, but the heavy table held. Another crash. A splinter of wood, sharp as a spear, was driven down through a crack in the floorboards, missing Juniper's head by inches. She cried out, scrambling back in the tight space. Gideon's pistol fired twice, in rapid succession. The shots were aimed low, through the door itself. A man screamed outside, a high, thin sound of agony quickly cut off. You'll pay for that, Gideon. Silas howled, his voice filled with rage. Suddenly, a new smell filled their hiding place. Acrid, oily, smoke. Juniper's blood ran cold. She remembered Gideon's story. "They burned my house down." "He's trying to burn us out," Mama gasped, her voice thick with panic. They could hear the crackle of flames now, starting at the base of the cabin wall. The smoke was getting thicker, seeping down through the floorboards, stinging their eyes, choking their lungs. The baby started to cough, a small, desperate, rattling sound. They were going to die down here. They would be burned alive or suffocate in the dark. "We have to get out," Mama whispered, her voice frantic. But Gideon's words echoed in Juniper's mind. "Don't come out until I tell you." The gunfire had stopped. The crackling of the flames grew louder, closer, an evil, hungry sound. "Give it up, Gideon," Silas yelled, his voice triumphant. "Come on out and face me like a man, or die in there with them. It makes no difference to me. I get to watch you burn, either way." The heat was becoming intense. The floorboards above them were growing warm to the touch. Juniper knew, with a certainty that chilled her more than the winter cold, that Gideon was not going to come out. He would die in there to protect them. He would let the fire take him. No, she would not let that happen. "Mama, give me the baby," Juniper said, her voice surprisingly steady. "What?" "No, Juniper. Give her to me," she insisted. Mama, perhaps too panicked to argue, handed over the small, warm, coughing bundle. Juniper looked at her mother in the suffocating darkness. "Stay here." Before Mama could stop her, Juniper pushed up on the floorboard. It was heavy, but her fear gave her strength. It lifted an inch, then two. Smoke billowed into their hiding place, hot and blinding. Juniper scrambled out into the cabin. The room was filled with smoke. Flames were licking up the wall near the door. In the center of the room, Gideon was on one knee, his face pale, his arm slick with blood. He was hit. He was trying to reload his pistol, his fingers clumsy and slow. He looked up as Juniper emerged from the floor, his eyes wide with shock and anger. "Get back down there." But Juniper ignored him. Clutching the baby to her chest, she walked to the barricaded door. "Stop!" she screamed, her voice high and thin against the roar of the fire. "We're coming out." Gideon tried to stand to stop her, but he stumbled, his wounded arm giving way. "Juniper, no." She ignored him. She used all her strength to push the heavy table, just enough to open the door a crack. She stepped out into the blinding white snow and the blistering heat of the fire. Silas Kane and his remaining man were standing there, their guns raised, their faces triumphant. Silas was a big man with a cruel, scarred face and dead black eyes. He looked at the small girl holding a baby, and a slow, evil smile spread across his face. "Well, well," he said, "look what we have here. Thorn's other brats." He took a step forward. "The girl has spirit, just like her father." He raised his pistol, aiming it directly at Juniper's chest. "A shame I'll have to put it out." Juniper stood her ground, her heart hammering, her legs trembling. She clutched her sister tighter. She was going to die. But she had bought Gideon time. Then a voice came from behind her. "Get away from my children." It was Mama. She had followed Juniper out of the hole, and in her hands she held Gideon's long, gleaming skinning knife. Her face was a mask of pure, protective rage. She was no longer a frightened widow. She was a she-bear, defending her cubs. Silas laughed. "You think that little sticker is going to stop me?" He shifted his aim from Juniper to Mama, but in that split second of distraction, he made a fatal mistake. He took his eyes off the cabin door. A shape exploded from the smoke-filled doorway. It was Gideon. He wasn't holding his pistol. He was holding the heavy iron fire poker. His face was a mask of fury, his eyes burning with a righteous, holy fire. He moved with a speed that was terrifying, inhuman. Before Silas could even turn, Gideon was on him. He swung the iron poker. It connected with Silas's gun hand with a sickening crunch of bone. The pistol flew from his grasp, landing in the snow. Silas screamed in pain and rage. His other man raised his rifle, but Mama was faster. She lunged forward, not at Silas, but at the man, slashing at his arm with the knife. He yelped and stumbled back. Gideon ignored him. His focus was entirely on Silas. He stood over the man who had taken everything from him. the man who had haunted his every waking moment for years. "This is for Sarah," he growled, his voice a low, guttural sound of pure vengeance. "And this is for my wife." He raised the poker again, but then he stopped. His eyes flickered to Juniper, standing in the snow, clutching her baby sister. To Mama, standing with the bloody knife, her chest heaving. He saw this new family, this fragile, broken, beautiful family that he had a chance to save. His expression changed. The burning hatred in his eyes cooled, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. He lowered the poker. "No," he said, his voice clear and steady. "I'm not you, Silas. I won't become you." He dropped the poker into the snow. "It's over." Silas, clutching his shattered hand, stared at him, his face contorted with pain and disbelief. "You're just going to let me live?" he sneered. "Living with what you are is a worse punishment than any I could give you," Gideon said. Just then, another sound cut through the air, the sound of approaching horses. Lots of them. The town sheriff, alerted by the sound of the gunshots echoing through the mountains, had finally arrived with a posse. Silas's face went from rage to pure animal panic. He was trapped. Justice hadn't come from the end of Gideon's gun. It had come riding up the trail on horseback. Gideon looked at Mama, at Juniper, at the burning cabin that had been their sanctuary. He was wounded, exhausted, and his past had finally caught up to him. But for the first time in years, he wasn't running. He was home. The aftermath was a blur of smoke, snow, and strangers. The sheriff and his men took Silas Kane and his wounded crony into custody. The story came tumbling out, from Mama, from Gideon, confirmed by the wanted poster that had somehow survived the fire in his saddlebag. Gideon wasn't a wanted man anymore. He was a witness, a hero. The townsfolk, who had whispered and judged, now looked at Mama and her children with a new respect. They looked at Gideon with awe. They helped put out the fire, saving what little was left of the cabin. They brought blankets, food, and medicine for Gideon's arm. The wound was clean, the bullet having passed straight through the fleshy part of his upper arm. Mama cleaned and bandaged it with a practiced gentleness, her hands steady. As the sun began to set, casting long blue shadows across the snow, the sheriff approached Gideon. "You'll have to come to town," he said. "Give a formal statement. We'll need you to testify against Kane." Gideon nodded. He looked at the charred remains of the cabin, then at Mama, Juniper, and the baby, who were huddled together in borrowed blankets. "They can't stay here," the sheriff said, following his gaze. "The cabin's ruined." Martha, one of the women who had first visited, stepped forward. "They can stay with me," she offered, her face full of a shame that was also an apology. But Mama shook her head. She looked at Gideon. Her eyes were clear and certain. "We go where he goes," she said. It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact, a declaration. Juniper's heart swelled. They were a family, a strange, scarred, cobbled-together family, but a family nonetheless. They rode down the mountain together. Juniper rode with the sheriff, the baby bundled safely in Mama's arms on another horse. Gideon rode Dusty, his arm in a sling, his face grim but peaceful. The town was a confusing jumble of lights and people. They were given a room at the boarding house, warm and clean. For the next few weeks, Gideon gave his testimony. The story of the Black Creek boys, of the fire, of the years on the run, it all came out. Silas Kane, stripped of his power and his men, was just a pathetic, hateful old man. He was sentenced to hang. The ghost that had haunted Gideon for so long was finally laid to rest. One evening, after it was all over, Gideon came to their room. He held his hat in his hands, looking awkward and out of place in the clean, civilized room. "Well," he said, his voice quiet, "it's done." "What will you do now?" Mama asked, her voice soft. He shrugged his broad shoulders. "I don't know. The trail, I suppose. It's all I've known for a long time." Juniper's heart sank. After everything, was he still going to leave? "You could stay," Mama said, the same words she had spoken during the storm. But this time they held a different weight. They weren't an invitation. They were a plea. "There's land to be had here. A man could build a new practice. A doctor is needed in these parts." Gideon looked at her, at the hope in her eyes. He looked at Juniper, who was staring at him with all the force of her will, silently begging him not to go. He looked at the baby, sleeping peacefully in her cradle, a new life, a new beginning. A slow smile spread across his face. It was the first real smile Juniper had ever seen from him. It transformed his harsh features, erasing the years of pain and sorrow. "A man could," he said softly. "A man just might." He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him, shutting out the cold and the rest of the world. He hung his hat on the peg by the door. He was home. They never went back to the old cabin. They built a new one, on a piece of land closer to town, but still nestled in the quiet of the mountains. The townspeople helped, bringing lumber and supplies, their actions a silent apology for their earlier judgment. Gideon started a new practice. He was a good doctor, his hands, once scarred by violence, now gentle and healing. Mama, whose real name Juniper learned was Sarah, just like Gideon's lost daughter, found her smile again. Juniper grew up with two parents, a mother who had taught her to be brave, and a father who had taught her that the deepest wounds can heal, that the longest trails can lead home. And the baby, whom they named Hope, was a constant reminder that even in the darkest, coldest winter, new life is possible. It wasn't a perfect life. There were scars and there were memories. But it was real. And it was theirs. It was a home, built not on blood, but on choice, on courage, on one small act of kindness that had rippled out to save them all. Which city are you watching our video from? Please leave a comment down below, and if you enjoyed this story of survival and redemption, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more. Thank you for watching.